Hi, I'm Haley Walton, and the theme that I chose is teaching subject matter. So over the past 4 years, I've come to the conclusion that I am competent in using multimodal processes when teaching in order to make learning achievable for all of my students. So the two questions that I will be focusing on today are, first, how do students learn within a particular subject matter? And second, in what ways can I as a teacher represent the content and subject matter for my students? The way that I make learning achievable for all of my students is through the multimodal processes of visual aids, movement, and tactile learning. So my first piece of evidence is teaching through the use of visual aids. Visual aids can range anywhere from handouts to posters to many sources of technology. So the learning for visual aids came from my ELL practicums as well as a study abroad opportunity I had in Italy through the university. The majority of my planning was for densely ELL populated schools. So I learned that you need to not only plan for the visual aid that you're using, but how it's going to help make that concept more achievable for your students. So I'm going to talk about where I was then and where I have come to now. So then was my first practicum experience. I was teaching 5th grade at Human Elementary School. There were few ELL or SPED or behavior students. And the task was for me to teach vocabulary. So the way I taught this was I said the word, I read the definition, and I showed them the picture that was provided. And while students understood this and they wrote it down, I feel like they never really grasped the concept. So fast forward to my literature block. I was teaching 4th grade, and there were 7 ELL students, 3 special education students, and 3 behavior students. And I had to teach the word gritty. So the way that I taught the word gritty was I showed the picture, I read the definition, and said the word. Now the picture is up here, and it shows feet covered in sand. And the majority of my students have never had the opportunity to go to a beach or feel sand. They couldn't make that connection. So what I did is that I brought in sandpaper and showed it to them, and I said, this is what gritty looks like. It doesn't have to be sand. This is something that's gritty. And so the way I knew that that learning was achievable is that when tested, they were able to accurately define the word and use it in the sentence. My second piece of evidence is how I make learning achievable through the use of movement. So the use of movement I like to call the full body experience, because not only are they using their heads, but they're using their full bodies to learn. So most of my learning took place in the health and wellness class, as well as my practicum experiences. So while planning, I noticed that students have very short attention spans. And this is a problem if you want to keep behavior under control. So then I came to my student teaching experience and was asked to plan an entire science unit on outer space. And this was very dense in vocabulary, and we had 9 ELL students and 6 behavior and SPED students. So this was a challenge for me, and I knew that in order for them to grasp these concepts, I needed to get them up and acting out these words so they could make that connection. So then was my math block, and it was for kindergarten. And the task at hand was teaching them how to skip count. So what I did is I started with a short 5-minute lesson talking about what skip counting is. And then I had all students get up, and I had taped around the room numbers from 0 to 10. And what I did is I modeled first, and I said, in order to skip count from 0 to 2, I need to jump over the 1 onto the 2. And from the 2 over the 3 onto the 4. And the students repeated that action with me while saying it out loud. So I knew that this learning was achievable because when they were assessed, they were able to skip count by using these methods that they were taught. Then for student teaching, I was teaching the word rotation. And the word rotation, most students know, but when it comes to relating it to our Earth, it's a very difficult concept. And so the first thing that I did is that I taught them a brain clue. And this brain clue was to say rotation, rodation, because one rotation of Earth takes 24 hours or 1 day. So when they were saying rotation, rodation, they had that memorized. All students stood up in a circle around the room, and we all rotated counterclockwise in order to show the rotation of Earth. While we were rotating, I said rotation, they said rodation, and they were able to grasp that concept. I made the learning achievable for all of our students. My third piece of evidence is making learning achievable through tactile learning. And using the sense of touch not only encourages students in their learning, but it makes it fun and exciting, and that really gets them engaged and ready to learn. So the learning from this came from all of my practicum experiences, but also my art methods course. So while planning, I came across a common misconception that I started to fall into, and that is using tactile learning takes too much time to plan and teachers don't have enough time to do this. Well, what I've learned is that it really does not take as much time as you think. And if you plan and you know when it is most appropriate to use tactile learning, then it's easy to do. So my planning consisted of determining the most appropriate ways to teach the concept and then deciding which tactile objects would be used for that concept and planning to explain why we're using these to help us learn. So then was my math block kindergarten practicum, and I was teaching the students about the characteristics of weather in the winter and fall. So we had different stations. Half of my students were at the winter station and they were creating snow. So they used shaving cream and glue and they would finger paint this onto paper. When it dried, it looked like snow. They then labeled it winter and they drew characteristics of winter on there. For the fall station, they were doing leaf rubbings of leaves found more in the spring and more in the fall and being able to tell the difference between the fall leaves and the spring. For student teaching, this was one of my most challenging lessons I've had because I had to teach solid figures in their nets in one day with their unit assessment the next day. And when I was going through school, this was a very difficult concept for me because I need to hold objects to see them. I need to unfold them in order to learn. So I cut out a lot of different nets of figures and I gave them to the students. I didn't give them any instructions, but what they did is they started folding them along the lines, and when they were folded in, they realized that it makes these solid figures. So I know that the learning was achievable because when they were tested, they were able to use their knowledge of these flat shapes and what they looked like folded in order to do well on their assessments. So that leads me to my synthesis and my reasoning. And the first question that I had asked that I was trying to answer was, how do students learn within a particular subject matter? And what I learned is that there are infinite ways that we can represent content and subject matter, but for me as an individual, using visual aids, movement, and tactile learning are the best ways for my students to learn. It makes learning fun and easy, and it helps students conquer difficult subject matter. My second question was, in what ways can a teacher represent the content and subject matter for the students? So creating achievable learning is completely dependent on the resources that you as a teacher give to your students and the style of instruction that you choose to use. Learning will become achievable through the use of multimodal processes, so such as visual aids, movement, and tactile learning. But what is most important to know is that students all have different learning styles, and this will change from year to year. So it is my job as a teacher to identify what processes work best for my students and adapt my instruction based on that. To synthesize, these multimodal processes make the learning achievable for all students because the students can make connections between what they're reading and what they're hearing to what they feel, do, and see in a lesson. Using these multimodal processes are useful for all students regardless of their age, their gender, their nationality, or their learning differences. Learning becomes engaging and motivational for students, and that makes learning fun. Sometimes one process works better for any given lesson, and sometimes none of these work. So that leads me to my reflective practices. Using multimodal processes can make learning achievable for all students when I, as a teacher, can identify what processes need to be used and when they are most appropriate to be used. From the beginning of the program until today, I've realized that the greatest takeaway from my competency statement is that all three of these processes can work collaboratively together. For the future, I am confident in the ability to be self-reflective and be able to plan instruction using these multimodal processes, as well as identifying the connections between what process I'm using and why I'm using it and how it is making this concept more achievable for my students. Next year, I will be teaching 6th grade math and science and plan to use my knowledge of these processes to make learning more enjoyable and also achievable for all of my students.